Hello students, welcome to MOOC Political Economy 1. The topic for today's discussion is globalization and the political economy of capitalist democracies. Let us begin with a fundamental question. What exactly is globalization? Globalization is an intensification of worldwide interconnectedness which has contributed to the concept of a global village and has familiarized us with a borderless world. But it is a multi-dimensional process. It has to be understood as one with several facets, and therefore globalization is not reducible to a single economic logic and which has different impact upon the world's regions and upon individual states. It does not unfold over a level playing field, and therefore people across the world stand to be differently affected by this process. It has a long history. From the age of pre-modern empire building to the contemporary era of corporate empires, globalization has traversed a long path. Of course, its contemporary articulation has several unique and distinctive attributes. It can be argued that across many domains, from the cultural to the technological, globalization has contributed to a remarkable politicization of social life. Such developments are most in evidence with respect to political and economic globalization. I have said again and again that the central aspect of globalization is its economic reality, which is why authors like Deepak Nair and Amit Bhaduri refer to globalization, privatization, and liberalization as all euphemistic expressions celebrating the high noon of capitalism. So capitalism remains the central issue, and that is why it makes sense to begin by emphasizing the economic aspect of globalization. Patterns of economic globalization have woven strong and enduring webs across the world's regions, the major regions, such that their economic fate is intimately connected. It has been suggested that contemporary financial globalization is a market-driven than a state-driven phenomenon. Though I would clarify in this context that the state is an important aspect of contemporary globalization. It is not only technologically driven, it is also state-driven to a large extent, which I shall clarify subsequently. Reinforced by financial liberalization, the accompanying shifts towards markets and private financial institutions as the authoritative actors in the global financial system poses serious questions about the nature of state power and economic sovereignty. And central to the organization of this new global capitalist order is the multinational corporation, which is seen as an important vehicle of globalization. The operation of multinational corporations integrate national and local economies into global and regional production networks. Under these conditions, national economies no longer function as autonomous systems of wealth creation, since national boundaries are no longer significant barriers to the conduct and organization of economic activity. And in that sense, we talk about a borderless world whenever it comes to contemporary globalization. But the important question is, how is contemporary globalization different from earlier versions? The earlier integration of the world economy was driven more by technological changes in transport and communication than by policy changes. By contrast, today's most drastic change is the degree to which governments have intervened to reduce obstacles to the flow of trade and investments worldwide. And in that sense, I say that today's globalization is not only technology-driven, it is also state-driven to a large extent. The story of contemporary globalization must therefore be written in two inks, and this is argued by Jagdish Bhagwati, and he says that one is the ink of technological change, the other is state action. By no means, however, Does globalization imply that the local and the national are subordinate to the global? Rather, it highlights the deepening as well as the broadening of the political process in the sense that the local, national, and global events continuously interact. What are the advantages of globalization that we understand happening in the world today? Stiglitz draws attention to the obvious advantages emanating from globalization. Opening up to international trade has helped many countries to grow at a much faster rate than would have been possible otherwise. International trade aids economic development when a country's exports drive its economic growth. In fact, export-led growth was the centerpiece of the industrial policy that enriched much of Asia and improved the plight of millions of people inhabiting that continent. Globalization has also reduced the sense of isolation felt in much of the developing world and has given many people in the developing countries access to knowledge well beyond the reach of even the wealthiest in any country a century ago. But despite these advantages which globalization entails, there are accusations that are hurled against the West, which has been the seat of globalization. A growing divide between the haves and the have-nots has left increasing numbers in the third world in dire poverty, living on less than $1 a day. This is also drawn attention to by Joseph Stiglitz. Despite repeated promises of poverty reduction made over the last decade of the 20th century, the actual number of people living in poverty has actually increased by almost 100 million. This occurred at the same time that total world income actually increased by an average of 2.5% annually. The critics of globalization accuse Western countries of hypocrisy, and the critics are not entirely wrong. The Western countries have pushed poor countries to eliminate trade barriers but have kept up their own barriers. So this kind of duplicity has definitely costed the third world countries quite heavily. But how have the Western advanced capitalist countries ushered in a risk society? It is not that while the third world countries have been periled by some of the vicissitudes resulting from globalization, it is also true that even the West, which has been the epicenter of globalization, it is also true that the West has suffered. Globalization has been criticized because of its tendency towards risks, uncertainty, and instability. And that is because globalization in some measure and in good measure verges on the ascendancy of worldwide capitalism, and capitalism, as you know, also verges on extreme individualism and social isolationism. And therefore, this kind of uncertainty and instability become part and parcel of a process that intensifies capitalism. Globalization has been associated with risk and uncertainty in at least three ways. In the first place, global financial markets that are inherently unstable increasingly influence economic decision making. This is because much of their activity is speculative and they are driven by short-term economic considerations. The fate of companies, industries, national economies, and even regions of the world is therefore subject to the whims of the financial market. But a risk society also has other manifestations. It is one that is characterized by rising individualism and an associated weakening of tradition, community, and established traditions and institutions, which is why many people look upon a globalization as basically a threat to their own cultural identity. Uncertainty in this respect goes beyond an increase in the pace and a reduction in the predictability of economic and social change, in that it has a personal dimension and sometimes even a psychological one at that. People's basic values and even a sense of identity are all called into question. The term refers to the notion that the risks we now face result as much from previous attempts to apply technology or social policies to practical problems as from external factors. Thus, people are increasingly aware of the insecurities associated with developments elsewhere in society. It is therefore increasingly difficult for advantaged groups to insulate themselves against the risks of, for example, technological changes which lead to unemployment among professionals as well as manual workers, or health problems which result from technological changes that seem to influence and affect our diet. We must also not overlook the tremendous problems wrought on environment because of limitless desire to harness more and more profit, and that invariably entails an assault on material resources. And that is why it is alleged that the third form of instability is the tendency of globalization towards environmental crisis and degradation and destruction. Eco-sociologists explain this by reference to capitalism's blind concern with profits and its insensitivity to ecological issues. By spreading materialism and entrenching absolute faith in science and technology, industrialism undermines human values and deadens sensibilities. Reformist ecologists therefore make a clarion call for global environmental protection. The main agenda of the neoliberal ideology trumpeting the cause of the untrammeled financial speculation, export competition, and capital accumulation, all of which verge on globalization, has been to free markets from states. And that seems to have been the main agenda of globalization, how to give more and more space to the market and keep the state away from any encroachment in that domain. Yet, states, and above all the world's most powerful states, have played an active role and often a crucial role in making globalization happen. And that is why we take the capitalist democracies of the West into consideration. The desire of the opponents of neoliberalism to seek to strengthen the role of states vis-a-vis markets is understandable. Why? It reflects the hope that votes rather than dollars might determine the choices that govern our lives. The state is, after all, an usherer of globalization. It is definitely state-driven as much as it is technology-driven. But at the same time, the states must understand that not only must they adapt themselves to globalizing trends and currents across the world, states must also look into the needs of those segments of the population which cannot take adequate advantage of the opportunities offered by the globalization process. But what has resulted is a remarkable idealization of the state as the repository of community values and social needs. And that is why the concept of embeddedness becomes relevant. And it seems to have become the new catchword, because as long as markets are embedded in society, they can be prudent and efficient and also just. So what is the basic dilemma that is confronting the capitalist democracies, which has often been the epicenter of globalization? In a more interdependent world, simply to achieve domestic objectives, national governments are forced to engage in extensive multilateral collaboration and cooperation. But in becoming more embedded systems of global and regional governance, states confront a real dilemma. In return for more effective public policy and meeting the manifold demands of their citizens, whether in relation to drugs, trade, or employment, their capacity for self-governance, that is state autonomy, is compromised. Hence, the concern of the opponents of neoliberalism for strengthening the role of the state vis-a-vis markets. The state ought to have its feet firmly planted on the ground of social interests, that is embedded in society, and concerns of broader societal interests. Because everywhere across the world, in both the West and in other parts of the world, we see that there are losers of globalization. There seems to be a widespread view among economists that globalization has resulted in unskilled workers becoming particularly vulnerable to economic and technological change, and they seem to be falling behind their more highly educated colleagues in terms of earning and job security. Such developments are engendering a political fear that rising income inequality could well spark a political backlash against free trade and the neoliberal agenda. The deep integration entailed by globalization is exposing a fault line between groups who have the skills and the mobility to flourish in global markets and who either don't have the advantage or perceive the expansion of unregulated markets as inimical to social stability. So, what is the basic problem that is facing the industrialized countries? Several economists hypothesize that growing income inequality in the industrial countries will generate political effects in the form of greater protectionism or even severe social disruption. Yet, the theories linking these economic and political outcomes are either unstated or underdeveloped. In particular, little attention is given to the role of domestic political and economic institutions in channeling the effects of trade or other economic changes, like the introduction of new technologies within particular societies. Given the wide variance in levels of social disruption, like strikes, riots, and so forth, among countries that are similarly exposed to international trade, it appears that domestic institutional variables must loom large in the story. Let us take a look at the evolution of the modern globalized economy, and that is relevant for understanding the situation of the capitalist democracies of the West today. The modern globalized economy came into existence in the second half of the 20th century, and it was a product of basically two phases. The first phase, which lasted from World War II to early 1970, was characterized by new arrangements for the management of the international financial system in the post-war period, which became known as the Bretton Woods system and which ultimately ushered in an era of multilateral governance and multi-layered governance. So you have the IMF, the WTO, and the World Bank emerging as the institutional apparatus of globalization, setting the tune to which countries across the world would want to play second fiddle. Through a system of fixed exchange rates, regulation, and support, Bretton Woods aimed to prevent a return to the beggar thy neighbor economic policies that had contributed to the Great Depression of the 1930s and in the process helped to fuel political extremism and aggression. Together with the Marshall Plan, which provided the US aid to Europe, and you know that US was following the policy of isolationism for a very long time. So after the Second World War, when it got interested in world politics and wanted to get involved in world politics increasingly, it tried to reach out through the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. In particular, it wanted to support post-war reconstruction in Europe and the wide adoption of the Keynesian economic policies aimed at delivering sustained growth. The Bretton Woods system underpinned the so-called long boom of the post-1945 period. In substantially expanding productive capacity and helping to fashion a consumerist form of capitalism, it laid the basis of the later accelerated economic globalization. So what was the neoliberal revolution that was witnessed by the capitalist democracies of the West subsequent to the Bretton Woods era? Since the 1980s, economic development has, to a greater or lesser extent in different parts of the world, taken on a neoliberal guise. That means basically the state is retracting from the market domain and leaving more space to the private players. Neoliberalism reflects the ascendancy of enterprise capitalism over rival forms of capitalism, its chief belief being a form of market fundamentalism. The neoliberal revolution was in fact a counter-revolution. Its aim was to halt and, if possible, reverse the trend towards big government and state intervention that has characterized much of the 20th century and especially the early post-1945 period. So basically, the state was withdrawing from most of its welfare responsibilities and trying to carve out more and more space to private players. The chief academic exponents of neoliberalism were Hayek and Friedman. A central object of their attack was Keynesianism and the tax and spend policies that they claimed were responsible for the stagflation of the 1970s, a combination of economic stagnation and therefore rising unemployment and high inflation, and a general rise in price level. The neoliberal solution was to roll back the frontiers of the state and to give full, or at least a much fuller rein, to market forces. How did economic globalization, that's the interesting question now that we would like to address, support the advance of neoliberalism? Economic globalization supported the advance of neoliberalism in a number of ways. In particular, intensified international competition encouraged governments to deregulate their economies and reduce tax levels in the hope of attracting inward investment and preventing transnational corporations from relocating elsewhere. Strong downward pressure was exerted on public spending and particularly welfare budgets by the fact that in a context of heightened global competition, the control of inflation has displaced the maintenance of full employment as the principal goal of economic policy. Such pressures, together with the revived growth and productivity rates of the US economy and the relatively sluggish performance of other models of national capitalism in Germany and Japan in particular, meant that by the late 1990s, neoliberalism appeared to stand unchallenged as the dominant ideology of the new world economy. So we definitely encountered the global triumph of neoliberalism. And this has been regarded by neoliberals and supporters as the clearest argument in favor of market reforms and economic liberalization. The advance of neoliberalism coincided not only with 3 decades of growth in the USA and its renewed economic ascendancy, firmly bearing, for example, predictions that had been widely made in the 70s and 80s that the USA was about to be eclipsed by Japan and Germany, but also by 3 decades of growth in the world economy. In this light, neoliberalism was based on a new growth model that has clearly demonstrated its superiority over the Keynesian welfarist orthodoxy of old, and therefore the assertion of neoliberalism. At the core of the neoliberal growth model are financial markets and the process of financialization. This was made possible by massive expansion of the financial sector of the economy, explaining the growing importance of Wall Street, the City of London, Frankfurt, Singapore, and elsewhere. In this process, capitalism was turned into turbo-capitalism, benefiting from greatly expanded monetary flows that were seeking an outlet in increased investment and higher consumption across the world. And one of the other key features of this neoliberal growth model was a deeper integration of domestic economies into a world economy, and so an acceleration of economic globalization, the shift in many of the leading economies from manufacturing to services, and the enthusiastic introduction of new information technologies often seen as the growth of the knowledge economy. But neoliberalism is not without its criticisms. The critics, for instance, have argued that in rolling back welfare provision and in promoting an ethic of material self-interest, greed is good, that seems to have been the abiding slogan, neoliberalism struggles to maintain popular legitimacy as an economic doctrine because of its association with widening inequality and social breakdown. This led to a modification, although not a rejection, of the neoliberal revolution in countries like New Zealand, Canada, and UK during the 1990s, and even to a reappraisal of neoliberal priorities in the USA under President Obama from 2009 onwards. In other words, neoliberalism was trying to understand its consequences, and in trying to evaluate its consequences, it realized that there were certain sections of the population who were definitely not gaining from the process, and they had to be given a helping hand. Some kind of affirmative action on part of the state could not be completely denied. The limitations of neoliberalism as a program for development were exposed by the failure of many shock therapy experiments in market reform, not only in the pioneering case of Chile, but also in the disappointing outcomes of many structural adjustment programs in the developing world. The IMF and the World Bank were dishing out aid to the third world for various development projects ostensibly, but that aid was never aid without strings. And therefore the third world countries were often running faster and faster just to stay at a conveyor, just to stay at the same place, some kind of a conveyor belt effect which has been likened to a debt trap. In cases such as Russia, the growth of unemployment and inflation and the deep insecurities unleashed by the shock therapy application of neoliberal principles created a backlash against market reform and led to strengthened support for nationalist and authoritarian movements. Therefore, the seamy side of capitalist democracies seemed to have surfaced with the dawning of the neoliberal agenda. What Robert Cox calls hyper-liberal globalizing capitalism is rooted in major contradictions and struggles, meaning that its dominance is destined to be challenged and eventually overthrown. These contradictions include the democratic deficit that is generated by the internationalization of the state, the tendency of the state to respond to the dictates of the global economy rather than to public opinion, the growing pressure to protect the environment from the ravages caused by relentless economic growth, and the surrender of state authority to corporate financial and economic interests. In highlighting the rise of disaster capitalism, Naomi Klein, who has also familiarized us with the concept of brand wars raging in the West and promoting relentless and mindless consumerism, Naomi Klein says that the extent to which the advance of neoliberalism has been implicated in shocks, states of emergency and crisis of one kind or another, thus suggesting that the USA's foreign policy adventurism from the overthrow of Allende to the war on terror has been linked to the spread of neoliberalism. The interesting question before us is therefore, should economic globalization be welcomed and embraced, or should it be resisted? There are positive arguments, including the magic of the market. From an economic liberal perspective, the market is the only reliable means of generating wealth, the surest guarantee of prosperity and economic opportunity. This is because the market, competition, and the profit motive provide incentives for work and enterprise and also allocate resources to their most profitable use. From this perspective, economic globalization, based on the trans-border expansion of market economics, is a way of ensuring that people in all countries can benefit from the wider prosperity and expanded opportunities that only capitalism can bring. The other arguments about the positivities of the neoliberal creed is that everybody is likely to emerge as a winner. The great advantage of economic globalization is that it is a game of winners and winners. Although it makes the rich richer, it also makes the poor less poor. This occurs because international trade allows countries to specialize in the production of goods or services in which they have a comparative advantage, with other benefits accruing from the economies of scale that specialization renders possible. Similarly, transnational production is a force for good. Transnational corporations spread wealth, widen employment opportunities, and improve access to modern technology in the developing world, which helps to explain why developing world governments are usually so keen to attract inward investment. Economic globalization is thus the most reliable means of reducing poverty. And it is also held staunchly by the advocates of neoliberalism that economic globalization does not make societies richer, rather, an open market based economy also brings social and political benefits. Social mobility increases as people are able to take advantage of wider working, career, and educational opportunities, and the despotism of custom and tradition is weakened as individual and self expression are given wider rein. All this leads to the celebration of multiculturalism. Economic globalization is thus linked to democratization, the two processes coinciding very clearly in the 1990s. This occurs because people who enjoy wider economic and social opportunities soon demand greater opportunities for political participation, particularly through the introduction of multi-party elections. Therefore, the message is very clear. Economic freedoms promote other kinds of freedom and helps individuals to express themselves in their own independent ways. But there are negative aspects also. Deepening poverty and inequality is a major problem. Critics of globalization have drawn attention to the emergence of new and deeply entrenched patterns of inequality. Globalization is thus a game of winners and losers. It is not only winners and winners, as the protagonists claim. Critical theorists argue that the winners are TNCs and industrially advanced states, but particularly the USA, while the losers are in the developing world, where wages are low, regulation is weak or non-existent, and where production is increasingly oriented towards global markets rather than to domestic needs. Economic globalization is therefore basically a form of neocolonialism. It forces poor countries to open up their markets and allow their resources to be plundered by the rich states. Therefore, what we see is basically an argument advanced by scholars like Immanuel Wallerstein that there is global inequality raging across the world because the rich countries get more opportunity in the name of economic globalization to exploit those who are down the line. There also seems to have taken place the hollowing out of politics and democracy. Economic globalization diminishes the influence of national governments and thereby restricts public accountability. State policy is driven instead by the need to attract inward investment and the pressures generated by intensifying international competition. Integration into the global economy, therefore, usually means tax reforms, deregulation, and the scaling back of welfare. The alleged link between global capitalism and democratization is also a myth. Many states have introduced market reforms and sought to integrate into the global economy, have remained authoritarian, if not dictatorial, conforming to the principles of state capitalism. There is another argument that even when economic globalization has succeeded in making people richer, it is less clear that it has improved, still less enriched, the quality of their lives. This is because it promotes an ethic of consumerism and material self-interest. This is what we refer to as mindless consumerism, a point made by Naomi Klein. Cultural and social distinctiveness is lost as people across the world overconsume the same goods, buy from the same stores, and enjoy similar working practices and living conditions. This is particularly evident in the development of a brand culture which pollutes public and personal spaces in order to create a culture of unthinking and mindless consumerism. So, are states hollowing out in the West? It seems that since the 1980s, many commentators have drawn attention to the progressing hollowing out of the state. The most common explanation for this has been the changed relationship between the state and the market that has been brought about by the pressures generated by economic globalization. This is reflected in the general trend towards neoliberalism, most dramatically demonstrated by the transition from collectivized to market-based economies in former communist countries during the 1990s, but it is also evident to some degree across the globe through the adoption of policies of privatization, deregulation, and the rolling back of the welfare provision. But it seems, however, that the state has redefined itself and has emerged as more of a competition state, where it is encouraging competition, all right, it is giving more space to private players, but it is not completely turning a blind eye to its affirmative role with respect to those sections of the population who cannot take advantages of the opportunities of economic globalization. Although this implies that states have lost substantial power over the economy, the process of economic globalization nevertheless requires a political framework that is provided by the state, notably in the form of the military territorial power of an enforcer. So the state has definitely not been eclipsed in the advanced Western democracies. In the modern global economy, this role has largely been assumed by the USA. Bob Jessup described the advent of a more market-oriented state in terms of a move away from the Keynesian welfare national state towards what he called the Schumpeterian competition state. The competition state, as I have said just a moment ago, is a state that aims to secure economic growth within its borders by securing competitive advantages in the wider global economy. Although they attempt to increase market responsiveness by promoting entrepreneurialism and labor flexibility, competition states are also aware of the need to combat social exclusion and to bolster the moral foundations of society. Therefore, the state today, although it is encouraging competition and providing more space at the economic domain, it is also not turning a blind eye to its responsibilities in respect of other sections of the population who are unable to take advantage of the freedoms and opportunities unleashed by a process of globalization working in hand with neoliberal ideology. Thank you.